last chance, Marcus! Apologise and leave!
Apologise? For telling the truth? You started this, now finish it!
The morning fog clung to the stone walls of Blackidge Academy like a shroud, its Gothic towers piercing through the mist as if the very architecture demanded reverence. This wasn't just a school, it was a fortress of tradition where family crests adorned every doorway and portraits of dead benefactors watched from gilded frames. The gravel crunched under expensive leather shoes as students emerged from sleek black cars, their voices carrying the confident drawl of inherited privilege. But standing at the wrought iron gates, clutching a worn canvas bag against his chest, was someone who didn't belong to this world of marble hallways and whispered legacies. Malik Thompson pressed his fingers against the cold metal bars, his breath forming small clouds in the October air. His school uniform, second-hand but meticulously pressed by his mother the night before, hung slightly loose on his lean frame. The blazer's fabric had seen better days. Its navy blue faded to something closer to charcoal, and his shoes, though polished to a mirror shine, bore the telltale creases of years of wear. The acceptance letter in his pocket felt heavier than paper should. A scholarship student, a charity case. The words hadn't been spoken aloud yet, but Malik could feel them hovering in the air like smoke waiting to choke him. His mother had worked double shifts at the hospital for months to afford even the reduced fees that came with his academic scholarship. "You're going to show them what we're made of," she had whispered that morning, her nurse's uniform already wrinkled from her overnight shift. "Your father would be so proud." The mention of his father sent a familiar ache through Malik's chest. 3 years. 3 years since the accident that took away the man who had taught him that strength wasn't about the size of your fists, but the size of your heart. David Thompson had been many things: a champion fighter, a devoted father, a man who could command respect in any room he entered. But above all, he had been Malik's hero, the one who taught him that true power came from discipline, not dominance. "Never use your fists in anger, son," his father had said during one of their last training sessions, his weathered hands guiding Malik through a complex combination. "Fighting is about protection, not pride. The moment you let anger drive your hands, you've already lost the most important battle, the one for your soul." Those words echoed in Malik's mind as he watched the sea of pale faces stream past him, their conversations a symphony of inside jokes and weekend plans that cost more than his mother made in a month. Some glanced his way, curious looks that lingered a beat too long on his dark skin, his carefully maintained dreadlocks, the slight tension in his shoulders that spoke of someone perpetually ready for trouble. The first bell rang across the courtyard, its bronze tone cutting through the morning chatter like a blade. Students began moving with practiced efficiency toward the main building, their movements choreographed by years of routine. Malik took a deep breath, tasting the sharp October air mixed with something else, the metallic flavor of fear, perhaps, or anticipation. He couldn't tell the difference anymore. As he pushed open the heavy oak doors, the warmth of the building hit him like a wall. The entrance hall stretched before him like a cathedral, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadow above stained glass windows that painted the floor in jeweled light. Every footstep echoed, amplified by the stone walls until it sounded like an announcement of his presence. Students moved in clusters, their voices dropping to whispers as they noticed the new arrival, the outsider in their carefully curated world. The administration office sat tucked behind a mahogany door marked with gold lettering so ornate it might as well have been a warning. Mrs. Pemberton, the headmaster's secretary, looked up from her desk with the expression of someone who had been interrupted from very important work. Her silver hair was pulled back in a bun, so tight it seemed to stretch her features, and her glasses hung from a chain that clinked softly as she moved. "You must be the Thompson boy," she said, her voice carrying the weight of generations of received pronunciation. There was something in the way she said "boy" that made Malik's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Not young man, not student, boy. Your paperwork is here somewhere. Scholarship student, isn't it? The words hung in the air like an accusation. Around the office, other students waiting for various administrative matters turned their heads with the subtle interest of predators catching an unfamiliar scent. Malik nodded, his voice catching slightly in his throat. Yes, ma'am, academic scholarship. How fortunate for you, Mrs. Pemberton replied, though her tone suggested she found nothing fortunate about it at all. She handed him a manila folder thick with schedules, maps, and regulations. Your classes begin in 15 minutes. I trust you can find your way. It wasn't really a question, and they both knew it. This was Blackidge Academy's version of a baptism by fire. Throw the scholarship kid into the deep end and see if he could swim. Malik tucked the folder under his arm and nodded again, not trusting his voice to remain steady if he spoke again. The hallways stretched out before him like a maze designed by someone with a cruel sense of humor. Each corridor looked identical to the last. The same dark wood paneling, the same oil paintings of stern-faced men in academic robes, the same brass fixtures that gleamed with the kind of polish that came from having staff whose entire job was maintaining appearances. Students moved between classes with the casual confidence of people who had never doubted their right to be exactly where they were. Malik's first class was Advanced Mathematics, taught by Mr. Carruthers, in a room that smelled of chalk dust and old leather. The students were already seated when he arrived, their notebooks open and pens poised, with the readiness of people who had never considered that learning might be a privilege rather than a right. All eyes turned to him as he hesitated in the doorway, scanning for an empty seat. "Ah, our new student," Mr. Carruthers announced, his voice carrying across the room with the authority of someone who had been teaching the children of the wealthy for longer than Malik had been alive. "Class, this is Malik Thompson. He'll be joining us from—" He paused, consulting his paperwork with theatrical precision. "St. Catherine's Comprehensive in South London?" The name of his old school hung in the air like a confession. Public school, state education, everything that Blackidge Academy was not. Malik could feel the weight of 20 pairs of eyes assessing him, cataloguing his differences, filing him away in whatever mental category they reserved for people who didn't belong. He made his way to an empty desk in the third row, his bag catching slightly on another student's chair. "Sorry," he murmured, his London accent cutting through the received pronunciation around him like a knife through silk. The student, a pale boy with perfectly styled blonde hair and a watch that probably cost more than Malik's mother made in 6 months, looked at him with unconcealed disdain. "No worries, mate," the boy replied, his voice dripping with mockery as he attempted to mimic Malik's accent. A few students snickered, the sound barely audible but sharp enough to make Malik's shoulders tense. "Happens to the best of us, innit?" Mr. Carruthers cleared his throat, calling the class to order, but the damage was done. Malik had been marked, categorized, and dismissed all in the space of 30 seconds. He opened his notebook and tried to focus on the lesson, but he could feel the whispers starting behind him like a gathering storm. The morning passed in a blur of sideways glances and barely suppressed laughter. In English literature, when Malik offered an interpretation of a passage from Othello that was both insightful and passionate, the silence that followed felt less like respect and more like surprise, as if intelligence from someone who looked like him was unexpected. In history, when the teacher asked about the British Empire's impact on colonial subjects, the entire class seemed to turn toward Malik with expressions that ranged from curiosity to discomfort, as if his presence alone was a living reminder of uncomfortable truths they'd rather not discuss. But it was at lunch that the real education began. The dining hall at Blackidge Academy was a testament to the school's commitment to tradition and hierarchy. Long wooden tables stretched across a room that could have hosted medieval banquets, their surfaces worn smooth by generations of students who had sat in the same seats, eaten the same meals, and perpetuated the same systems of inclusion and exclusion that had governed this place for over 2 centuries. Malik stood in the doorway, tray in hand, watching the carefully choreographed social dynamics play out before him. Each table seemed to represent a different ecosystem: the athletes with their easy confidence and perpetual motion, the academic elite with their intense discussions and wire-rimmed glasses, the artists with their deliberately disheveled appearance and knowing smirks. And at the center of it all, occupying the prime real estate near the tall windows that overlooked the courtyard, was a table that seemed to command the attention of the entire room. James Whitmore sat at the head of that table like a young king holding court. Even at 17, he carried himself with the casual arrogance of someone who had never questioned his place in the world. His dark hair was styled with the kind of careless perfection that took considerable effort to achieve, and his uniform fit him like it had been tailored specifically for his frame, which, given his father's position as headmaster, it probably had been. Everything about James spoke of old money and older privilege, from the subtle gold signet ring on his pinky finger to the way other students seemed to orbit around him, desperate for his attention and approval. Malik found an empty table near the back of the room, close to the kitchen doors, where the constant traffic of staff members provided a buffer between him and the curious stares of his classmates. He unwrapped the sandwich his mother had packed, simple but made with love, and tried to ignore the conversations swirling around him. That's when he heard it. A voice, clear and carrying, pitched just loud enough to be heard over the general din of the dining hall. "I heard the new boys here on charity," James was saying, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone who had never faced consequences for his words. "Scholarship kid from some rough school in London. You can tell just by looking at him, can't you? The way he talks, the way he carries himself, like he's waiting for someone to throw him out." The laughter that followed was like breaking glass, sharp and scattered. Malik's hand tightened around his sandwich, the bread compressing under his fingers until it felt like cardboard. He could feel his father's training kicking in, the awareness of his surroundings, the controlled breathing, the way his muscles seemed to coil with potential energy. But stronger than any physical response was the memory of his father's voice. "Never use your fists in anger, son. I wonder what he did to deserve a place here." Another voice chimed in, Marcus Ashford, if Malik remembered correctly from the morning's introductions. Must have quite the sob story. Dead father, probably. Single mother working 3 jobs. You know the type. The accuracy of the guess hit Malik like a physical blow. How had they known? Had someone told them? Or was his situation so obvious, written so clearly in the careful way he preserved his second-hand clothes and the quiet desperation in his eyes? "Careful, James," a girl's voice warned, though there was more amusement than concern in her tone. "He might hear you, and you know what they say about boys from his kind of background. They're used to settling things with their fists." "Oh, I'm terrified," James replied, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "What's he going to do in it? Throw some chips at me?" The mockery of his accent was crude but effective, and the laughter that followed seemed to fill the entire dining hall. Malik looked up to see dozens of faces turned his way, some openly curious, others carefully neutral, all of them watching to see what he would do, how he would react, whether he would prove their assumptions right or wrong. For a moment that stretched like eternity, Malik sat frozen between 2 versions of himself. There was the version his father had raised, disciplined, controlled, strong enough to walk away from fights that weren't worth having. And there was the version that had survived 3 years in South London without his father's protection. Harder, angrier, ready to prove that respect was earned through strength, not granted through patience. But then he thought of his mother working another double shift to pay for his textbooks. He thought of the acceptance letter that had arrived like a miracle, offering him a chance at a future that extended beyond the housing estate where he'd grown up. He thought of his father's hands, gentle but calloused, guiding him through forms and combinations while teaching him that true strength meant knowing when not to fight. Malik finished his sandwich in silence, packed up his bag, and walked out of the dining hall with his head held high and his fists unclenched. Behind him, the laughter continued, but it sounded different now, less like victory and more like the hollow echo of people who mistake cruelty for strength. But what Malik didn't know, what none of them knew, was that his silence wasn't weakness. It was the calm before a storm that had been building for 17 years, trained and refined and held in check by a promise to a dead father and a love for a living mother. And storms, when they finally break, have a way of changing everything in their path. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the tall windows as Malik made his way to his next class, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. Somewhere behind him, he could hear James Whitmore's voice, still holding court, still dispensing casual cruelty like it was his birthright. But Malik wasn't listening anymore. He was thinking about promises, about fathers, and about the difference between being strong and being ready. And in the quiet depths of his controlled breathing, something ancient and patient was beginning to stir. The weeks that followed Malik's arrival at Blackidge Academy settled into a rhythm of calculated humiliation that felt as structured as the school's curriculum. James Whitmore and his circle had elevated the art of psychological warfare to something approaching academic study, dissecting Malik's vulnerabilities with the precision of scientists examining a specimen under glass. It started small, as these things always do. A foot extended just far enough into the aisle to catch Malik's ankle as he walked to his seat. Books knocked from his hands in crowded corridors, sending papers scattering across polished floors, while their owners offered hollow apologies that fooled no one. Whispered comments that followed him like shadows. "There goes the charity case," and "wonder if he knows which fork to use," and worse things that cut deeper because they carried the sting of truth wrapped in cruelty. The teachers, those supposed guardians of justice and fairness, became masters of selective blindness. When Malik's assignment was accidentally spilled with coffee, forcing him to rewrite 12 pages of careful analysis in his lunch break, Mr. Pemberton simply suggested he be more careful with his belongings. When his gym clothes went missing before physical education, leaving him to endure the embarrassment of sitting out while wearing his school uniform, Coach Davidson mentioned something about responsibility and keeping track of one's possessions. But it was the systematic nature of it that revealed James Whitmore's particular genius for cruelty. This wasn't random bullying born of boredom or opportunity. This was strategic, methodical, designed to break down Malik's resistance through 1,000 small cuts rather than one dramatic confrontation. James had studied his target, identified his weaknesses, and crafted a campaign that would leave no evidence, no proof. Nothing that could be reported to authorities who were already predisposed to see Malik as the problem rather than the victim. The worst part wasn't the physical inconveniences or even the constant vigilance required to navigate each day without giving his tormentors ammunition. The worst part was the isolation. Malik watched other students, decent kids probably, under different circumstances, turn away when he approached, their eyes sliding past him like he was made of glass. They weren't cruel exactly. They were just smart enough to recognize the social mathematics at play. Befriending the scholarship kid meant risking James Whitmore's attention, and that was a calculation no one seemed willing to make. In chemistry class, Malik found himself partnered with Sarah Chen, a quiet girl with serious eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses who seemed more interested in molecular structures than social hierarchies. For 20 minutes, he allowed himself to hope that maybe, finally, he'd found someone who saw him as more than his circumstances. They worked well together. their conversation flowing easily between academic discussion and tentative personal connection. "You're really good at this," Sarah said, watching him balance a complex equation with practiced ease. "Did you study advanced chemistry at your old school?" "My father helped me with it," Malik replied, the words coming easier than they had in weeks. He had a thing for understanding how things worked. Said chemistry was just another kind of fighting, understanding your opponent's strengths and weaknesses, knowing how to combine the right elements to get the reaction you wanted." Sarah smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth Malik had received since arriving at Blackidge. "That's a beautiful way to think about it. Your father sounds like he was—" "Sarah." The voice cut through their conversation like a blade. James Whitmore stood behind them, his presence commanding attention even in the middle of a laboratory full of potentially dangerous chemicals. "I think there's been a mistake with the seating arrangements. You're supposed to be working with me today." The transformation in Sarah's demeanor was immediate and heartbreaking. The warmth drained from her eyes, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. She glanced between Malik and James, the social calculus playing out across her features in real time. Mr. Harrison assigned the partners randomly. I don't think—" "I had a word with him," James interrupted, his tone carrying the casual authority of someone accustomed to having his preferences reshape reality. "Family donation to the new science wing. You understand how these things work." Malik watched Sarah gather her materials, her movements mechanical and apologetic. She didn't meet his eyes as she relocated to James's station, but he could see the regret in the set of her shoulders, the way her hands trembled slightly as she unpacked her notebook. Another casualty of a war he hadn't asked to fight. The pattern repeated itself across every aspect of school life. In the library, whispered conversations would fall silent when he approached, students suddenly finding urgent reasons to be elsewhere. In study hall, the seats around him remained empty even when the room was crowded, creating a bubble of isolation that felt more suffocating than any physical barrier. Even the staff seemed to view him with increasing suspicion, as if his mere presence was somehow disruptive to the natural order of things. But it was during rugby practice that James's campaign reached its most sophisticated level. Malik had been assigned to the team as part of his scholarship requirements, a way to demonstrate his commitment to school spirit and integration. The irony wasn't lost on him that the sport most associated with British upper-class culture would become another battlefield in his daily struggle to simply exist. Coach Davidson was a relic of a different era, a man who believed that character was forged through controlled violence, and that weakness was something to be identified and eliminated rather than supported and strengthened. He watched Malik with the calculating gaze of someone evaluating livestock, noting his build, his speed, his obvious athletic potential with an interest that felt more predatory than professional. "Thompson," he called during their third practice, his voice carrying across the muddy field where 30 boys were learning to hurt each other within the bounds of acceptable rules. "You're with the first team today. See how you handle yourself against some real competition." The first team was James Whitmore's domain, populated by boys who had been playing rugby since they could walk, who understood the game's unwritten rules about when violence was acceptable and how much was too much. They welcomed Malik with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for fresh meat thrown into a lion's den. The scrimmage began innocently enough. Malik held his own, his natural athleticism and quick reflexes compensating for his lack of formal training. He could feel his father's conditioning in every movement, the balance, the awareness, the controlled aggression that came from years of disciplined training. For a few minutes, he almost allowed himself to enjoy the pure physicality of the sport, the way it demanded complete presence and focus. Then James got the ball. What happened next was textbook rugby, technically legal and absolutely deliberate. James charged toward Malik's position, but instead of seeking the clean tackle that would end the play, he lowered his shoulder and drove forward with the full weight of his body behind the impact. The collision sent Malik sprawling across the muddy ground, his shoulder screaming in protest as he rolled to absorb the force. "Sorry about that, mate," James called out, his voice carrying just loud enough for everyone to hear. "Thought you'd be quicker than that coming from where you do. Don't they teach you how to handle yourself in South London?" The laughter from the other players felt like acid in Malik's ears. He pushed himself to his feet, mud clinging to his uniform, his shoulder throbbing with each heartbeat. Coach Davidson was nodding approvingly from the sideline, as if the collision had revealed some essential truth about character and resilience. "That's rugby, boys," the coach called out. "Clean hit, good follow-through. Thompson, shake it off. Sport's not for the soft-hearted." But Malik could see the calculation in James's eyes, the way he was already positioning himself for the next play, the next opportunity to inflict punishment under the guise of athletic competition. This wasn't about rugby anymore. It was about power, about establishing hierarchy, about demonstrating to everyone watching that some people belonged on the ground while others belonged standing over them. The next play came quickly. Malik had the ball this time, running toward the try line with 3 defenders converging on his position. In his peripheral vision, he could see James approaching from an angle that would allow for a perfectly legal but brutally effective tackle. Time seemed to slow as Malik processed his options, his father's training asserting itself over the chaos of the moment. He could have dodged. His reflexes were quick enough, his movement fluid enough to avoid the collision entirely. He could have stepped aside and let James's momentum carry him harmlessly past, demonstrating the kind of superior technique that came from real training rather than inherited privilege. Instead, Malik planted his feet and braced for impact. The collision was spectacular. James launched himself forward with the confidence of someone who had never met an opponent he couldn't overwhelm through sheer aggression. But Malik didn't move. He absorbed the impact like a tree absorbing lightning, his muscles coiled and ready, his center of gravity perfectly balanced. The result was James bouncing off him like a wave hitting a seawall, sprawling backward onto the muddy ground with a look of shocked confusion. For a moment, the entire field fell silent. Coach Davidson's whistle hung unused in his mouth. The other players stood frozen, processing what they had just witnessed. James Whitmore, heir to the Blackidge Academy throne, son of the headmaster, natural leader of their social ecosystem, was sitting in the mud, looking up at a scholarship kid who had just demonstrated that privilege didn't automatically translate to power. "Good hit, Thompson," Coach Davidson finally called out, but there was something different in his voice now. Respect, perhaps, or maybe just the acknowledgement that he had underestimated his newest player. "That's how you stand your ground." But Malik could see the fury building in James's eyes as he climbed to his feet. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The humiliation of being knocked down in front of his peers, the challenge to his assumed authority, the demonstration that his target might not be as defenseless as he had assumed, all of it combined into something that looked dangerously like genuine hatred. The rest of practice passed without incident, but the tension crackled in the air like electricity before a storm. Malik could feel eyes on him as he made his way back to the locker room, conversations stopping and starting in whispers that followed him like smoke. He had crossed a line today, demonstrated a strength that his tormentors hadn't expected, and that kind of revelation always carried consequences. In the shower, as hot water washed the mud and sweat from his body, Malik allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. His father had always taught him that respect was earned through strength, not granted through submission. Today, for the first time since arriving at Blackidge Academy, he had earned something that felt like respect. But as he dried off and prepared to face whatever came next, Malik couldn't shake the feeling that he had also earned something else, something that would make the weeks ahead even more difficult than the ones behind him. James Whitmore's pride had been wounded in front of an audience, and wounded pride in someone with unlimited resources and no meaningful oversight was a dangerous thing indeed. The late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the courtyard as Malik made his way back to the dormitory, his rugby kit slung over his shoulder, his body still humming with the residual energy of physical exertion. Other students passed him in small groups, their conversations quieter than usual, their glances more curious than hostile. Word of what had happened on the rugby field was already spreading through the school's informal communication network, growing and changing with each retelling. But Malik wasn't thinking about rumors or reputation. He was thinking about his father, about the pride that would have shone in David Thompson's eyes if he could have seen his son stand his ground, demonstrate the strength that came from years of patient training and disciplined preparation. For the first time in weeks, Malik felt like he was honoring his father's memory rather than simply surviving in his absence. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that James Whitmore was also thinking about fathers, about reputation and legacy and the terrible weight of expectations that came with being the headmaster's son, about the conversation he would have with his father that evening, and the resources that would be deployed to ensure that no scholarship student, no matter how physically gifted, would ever again challenge the natural order of things at Blackidge Academy. The storm that had been building since Malik's first day was about to break, and when it did, everyone would discover just how much strength a person could possess while still maintaining the promise never to use their fists in anger. But promises, like all things made by humans, had their breaking points, and James Whitmore was about to discover what happened when you pushed someone past theirs. The transformation in James Whitmore's approach was immediate and merciless. If Malik had thought the previous weeks were difficult, he was about to discover that he had merely been experiencing the opening movements of a symphony of cruelty that James was now conducting with the precision of a master musician and the resources of institutional power behind him. It began with the photograph. Malik discovered it taped to his locker on a grey Monday morning, the kind of November day when the British sky seemed to press down on the earth like a lead blanket. The image was grainy, clearly taken from a distance with a phone camera, but the subject was unmistakable. Malik's mother, Linda Thompson, leaving the Royal London Hospital after another grueling night shift. She looked exhausted, her nurse's uniform wrinkled, her shoulders bent under the weight of 16 hours spent caring for other people's pain. She was beautiful still, but it was a beauty worn thin by sacrifice and struggle, by years of working double shifts to keep her son's future alive. Below the photograph, in handwriting that managed to be both elegant and venomous, someone had written, "Even the cleaning lady looks tired. Wonder if she knows her son is pretending to belong here." The words hit Malik like physical blows. Not just the casual racism, though that burned like acid in his throat, but the calculated cruelty of involving his mother, of dragging the woman who had sacrificed everything for his education into this poisonous world of adolescent warfare. His hands trembled as he tore the photograph down, crumpling it against his chest as if he could somehow protect her retroactively from this violation. "Everything all right there, mate?" The voice was silk wrapped around steel, and Malik didn't need to turn around to know that James Whitmore was standing behind him, probably with that particular smile that never reached his eyes. "You look a bit upset." "Family troubles." Malik forced himself to breathe, to remember his father's voice. "Anger is a fire that burns the house of the man who carries it." But the fire was building anyway, fed by weeks of accumulated humiliation and the sight of his mother's exhausted face being used as ammunition in someone else's war. "Stay away from my family," Malik said, his voice low enough that only James could hear, but carrying enough controlled fury to make several passing students stop and stare. "This is between you and me." "Oh, but that's where you're wrong." James replied, stepping closer until Malik could smell his expensive cologne, could see the gold flecks in his predatory eyes. You see, when you decided to embarrass me on the rugby field, you made it about more than just you and me. You made it about respect, about knowing your place, and people like you, he let the words hang in the air like a noose, need to understand that there are consequences for forgetting where you come from. The hallway around them had grown quiet, other students sensing the electricity in the air, the way the atmosphere changes before lightning strikes. Malik could feel their attention like heat against his skin, could sense their collective intake of breath as they waited to see what would happen next. This was the moment James had been orchestrating, the public confrontation where Malik would either back down and cement his position as a victim, or lash out and prove that he was exactly the kind of dangerous, uncontrolled element that didn't belong at Blackidge Academy. For a heartbeat that stretched like eternity, Malik wavered on the edge of 17 years of careful training. His father's lessons warred with his own burning need for justice, for dignity, for the simple human right to exist without being tormented for the crime of being different. His muscles coiled like springs. His breathing fell into the controlled rhythm that preceded every training session, every sparring match, every moment when his father had taught him to channel power through precision rather than rage. But then he thought of his mother, probably sleeping now after her shift, trusting that her sacrifice was buying him a future worth having. He thought of the acceptance letter that had arrived like a miracle, the opportunity that couldn't be squandered for the momentary satisfaction of putting James Whitmore on the ground where he belonged. Malik stepped back, unclenched his fists, and walked away. The laughter that followed him down the corridor was like breaking glass, sharp and cutting. But worse than the laughter was the silence that came after, the disappointed quiet of spectators who had been promised a show and received only anticlimax. Malik had chosen the path his father would have wanted, but it felt like defeat anyway. The campaign that followed was systematic and devastating. James had learned from the Rugby incident that direct confrontation wasn't the most effective approach. Instead, he began to dismantle Malik's world piece by piece, using methods that left no fingerprints but maximum impact. Malik's assignments began disappearing with suspicious frequency, not stolen exactly, that would have been too obvious, but misplaced, in ways that suggested administrative error rather than sabotage. When he complained to teachers, he was met with lectures about responsibility and organization. When he started keeping copies of everything, those disappeared too, somehow vanishing from his secured locker, despite the fact that only he knew the combination. His scholarship status became a weapon wielded with surgical precision. In economics class, when the teacher asked students to discuss their family's investment strategies, James made sure the conversation turned to different perspectives on financial planning, while looking directly at Malik. In art history, during a unit on private collections, someone always seemed to mention how educational it must be for people who had never seen original masterpieces before. Each comment was carefully crafted to sound educational rather than malicious, leaving Malik no recourse except to sit in burning silence. The social isolation became total. Sarah Chen, who had shown him kindness in chemistry, now avoided his eyes entirely. The few students who had seemed neutral before began treating him like he carried something contagious. Even the teachers started calling on him less frequently, as if his presence in their classrooms had become an inconvenience they preferred to ignore. But the worst was yet to come. It happened during a particularly brutal week in December, when the first snow had begun to fall and the Gothic architecture of Blackidge Academy looked more like a prison than ever. Malik had been working in the library, trying to complete a history assignment about colonial resistance movements, a topic that felt uncomfortably relevant to his current situation, when he overheard a conversation that made his blood run cold. James was sitting 3 tables away, surrounded by his usual court of sycophants and admirers, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry across the quiet study space. "My father's been asking about our scholarship student," he was saying, his tone conversational but loaded with implications. "Seems there have been some concerns about his integration into the school community." Marcus Ashford, James's most devoted follower, leaned in with the eager attention of someone who lived for gossip and cruelty. "What kind of concerns?" "Oh, academic performance suffering, social adjustment issues, the usual problems you see with students who aren't quite ready for the Blackidge experience." James paused, letting the implications sink in. "Father mentioned something about reviewing the scholarship program, making sure we're selecting candidates who can truly benefit from what we have to offer." The words hit Malik like physical blows. His scholarship, the lifeline that his mother had worked double shifts to support, the opportunity that represented everything his father had dreamed of for him, was being threatened. Not because of his grades, which were exemplary, or his behavior, which had been beyond reproach, but because James Whitmore had decided that his presence was inconvenient. Malik's hands gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles went white. The careful control he had maintained for months began to crack like ice under pressure. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about his mother's sacrifices, his father's dreams, the future that was being stolen from him by someone who had never worked for anything in his life. "Of course," James continued, his voice carrying a note of false sympathy that made Malik's jaw clench. "If he could find a way to demonstrate that he truly belongs here, that he understands and embraces our values, well, that might change things. But given his background, his attitude problems, the way he seems to struggle with basic social integration." He let the sentence trail off with a shrug that said everything. That night, Malik lay in his narrow dormitory bed, listening to the sounds of his roommates sleeping peacefully around him. Boys who had never wondered if they belonged anywhere, who had never had to prove their worth or justify their existence. The familiar weight of isolation pressed down on him like a physical thing, making it hard to breathe in the close air of the shared room. He thought about calling his mother, but what would he tell her? That her sacrifices were being wasted, that the opportunity they had both worked so hard to secure was slipping away because he couldn't figure out how to navigate the poisonous social dynamics of a world that had never been meant for people like them. The next morning brought fresh humiliation. Malik arrived at his first class to find his desk had been moved. Not dramatically, just shifted slightly out of alignment with the others, creating a visual reminder of his status as an outsider. When he moved it back, he found a note taped underneath. "Some people never learn where they belong." In the cafeteria, he sat alone at his usual table while conversations swirled around him like water around a stone. But now the isolation felt different. Not just social exile, but something approaching complete erasure. He was becoming a ghost in his own life, present but unacknowledged, visible but unseen. The breaking point came during assembly. Headmaster Whitmore, James' father and the ultimate authority at Blackidge Academy, stood at the podium addressing the entire school about maintaining standards and upholding the values that make our community special. His voice carried the weight of generations of institutional power, each word carefully chosen to sound inclusive while reinforcing exclusion. "We must remember," he said, his gaze seeming to settle on Malik in the crowd of students, "that Blackidge Academy is not just a school, it is a family. And like any family, we must ensure that every member contributes positively to our shared culture and traditions. Those who cannot or will not embrace what we stand for have no place in our community, regardless of their academic achievements or other considerations." The message was clear, and Malik could feel the weight of 400 pairs of eyes turning toward him. He was being publicly marked for removal, his scholarship status transformed from an opportunity into a threat that needed to be eliminated. The careful campaign of psychological warfare had reached its crescendo, and James Whitmore had won without ever having to throw a punch. As the assembly concluded and students began filing out, Malik remained in his seat, paralyzed by the enormity of what was happening to him. Months of careful restraint, of honoring his father's memory and protecting his mother's sacrifice, had led to this moment of complete defeat. He had played by their rules, maintained his dignity, refused to give them the excuse they needed to expel him outright, and it hadn't mattered. They were going to destroy him anyway. The afternoon classes passed in a blur of barely contained desperation. Malik found himself calculating possibilities, searching for escape routes that didn't exist. He could transfer schools, but his scholarship was specific to Blackidge Academy. He could complain to the authorities, but what evidence did he have? Every attack had been carefully orchestrated to appear like natural social dynamics rather than systematic persecution. By evening, as he sat in his dormitory room, pretending to study while his roommates chatted about weekend plans and holiday breaks, Malik had reached a conclusion that felt like swallowing poison. He was going to lose everything: his education, his future, his mother's faith in the sacrifices she had made, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. James Whitmore had won through patience and calculation, using the system itself as a weapon against someone who had never had a chance to fight back on equal terms. The promise Malik had made to his father, never to use his fists in anger, had become a chain around his ankles, dragging him down into defeat while his tormentor celebrated victory. But sometimes, in the deepest moments of despair, when hope seems like a luxury you can no longer afford, the universe provides one final test, one last opportunity to discover what you're really made of when everything else has been stripped away. Malik didn't know it yet, but tomorrow would bring that test. And when it did, he would discover that there were some things worth fighting for, even if it meant breaking a promise to the dead in order to protect the living. The snow continued to fall outside his window, covering the Gothic towers of Blackidge Academy in pristine white that would soon be trampled into grey slush. But for now, in the quiet hours before dawn, the school looked almost beautiful, like a place where dreams could come true instead of a fortress where they went to die. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tonight, Malik Thompson allowed himself to grieve the boy he had been, the one who believed that good intentions and hard work were enough to overcome systematic cruelty and institutional indifference. That boy was about to die. What would rise in his place remained to be seen. The day that would change everything began like any other in the cruel winter of Malik's existence at Blackidge Academy. December had settled over the school like a shroud, the ancient stones seeming to absorb what little warmth remained in the pale English sun. Students moved through the corridors with the sluggish energy of those counting days until holiday break, when they could return to families and homes where their place was never questioned, never threatened, never held hostage to the whims of institutional politics. Malik had spent the night staring at the ceiling, his mind cycling through options that didn't exist and solutions that led nowhere. The scholarship review that James had mentioned was real. He had seen the official letterhead peeking from beneath other papers on his advisor's desk, his own name visible in the subject line like a death sentence typed in formal font. 3 months at Blackidge Academy had taught him that the appearance of fairness was more important than actual justice, and that systematic persecution could be disguised as academic concern with surgical precision. The morning assembly felt different somehow, charged with an electricity that made the air itself seem to vibrate. Students filed into the great hall with an anticipation that suggested something had been planned, some entertainment that would break the monotony of academic routine. Malik took his usual seat in the back, as far from the center of attention as the architecture would allow, but he could feel eyes on him, more than usual, and with a hunger that made his skin crawl. Headmaster Whitmore took the podium with his characteristic gravity, his silver hair catching the light from the stained glass windows in a way that seemed calculated to enhance his authority. But today, instead of his usual lecture about tradition and excellence, he had prepared something special. "Today," he announced, his voice carrying easily across the assembled student body, "we're going to discuss a matter that affects our entire community. The question of what it truly means to belong at Blackidge Academy." Malik's blood turned to ice in his veins. This wasn't a general assembly, it was a public execution, dressed up in the language of educational discourse. Around him, students shifted in their seats with the electric anticipation of spectators at a gladiatorial event, sensing that they were about to witness something that would be talked about for years to come. "We've had some concerns raised," the headmaster continued, his gaze finding Malik in the crowd with laser precision, "about whether all of our students truly understand and embrace the values that make this institution special, about whether some individuals might be struggling to integrate into our community in ways that affect the experience of their peers." The silence in the hall was absolute. 400 students holding their collective breath, waiting for the moment when subtlety would give way to direct confrontation. Malik felt every muscle in his body tense, his father's training asserting itself automatically as his nervous system prepared for a threat it couldn't quite identify. But then something unexpected happened. James Whitmore stood up. "Father," he said, his voice carrying the casual confidence of someone who had never doubted his right to interrupt authority. "If I may." The headmaster's smile was paternal and proud, the expression of a man watching his legacy unfold exactly as planned. "Of course, James. I think your perspective as a student leader would be valuable here." What followed was a masterpiece of psychological warfare disguised as student testimony. James spoke about cultural differences and integration challenges and the importance of maintaining community standards in language that sounded reasonable and measured to anyone who wasn't paying attention to the subtext. He talked about unnamed students who seemed to struggle with basic social expectations and who appeared to harbor resentment toward the very institution that had given them unprecedented opportunities. Every word was a scalpel, cutting away at Malik's reputation and legitimacy with surgical precision. And through it all, James never mentioned him by name, never said anything that could be directly challenged or refuted. It was character assassination performed with the skill of a trained politician, leaving the victim with no recourse except to sit in burning silence while his destruction was applauded as public service. "The truth is," James concluded, his voice taking on a note of false regret that made Malik's jaw clench until his teeth ached, "some people simply aren't equipped for the demands of a place like this, and when their presence begins to affect the learning environment for everyone else, well, difficult decisions have to be made." The applause that followed was polite but enthusiastic, the sound of a community rallying around one of their own while casting out the interloper who had dared to think he belonged among them. Malik could feel his world collapsing in real time, his future crumbling like a house built on sand as the institutional machinery prepared to grind him to dust. But the assembly wasn't over. There was one more performance to come. "Actually," James continued, his voice carrying a new note that made Malik's blood run cold, "I think it would be educational for everyone to understand exactly what we're dealing with here, the kind of background some students come from, and how that affects their ability to function in a civilized environment." What happened next would be burned into Malik's memory forever, a moment of such calculated cruelty that it transcended ordinary bullying and entered the realm of genuine evil. James produced a manila folder from his bag, its contents arranged with the care of someone presenting evidence in a court of law. "This," he said, pulling out a photograph that Malik recognized with growing horror, "is Malik Thompson's family situation. His mother, Linda Thompson, works as a cleaner at the Royal London Hospital. The photograph was larger than the one that had been taped to Malik's locker, professionally printed, clearly taken with telephoto equipment from a hidden position. It showed his mother leaving the hospital, but this time the image captured her in a moment of exhaustion so complete it looked like despair. Her shoulders were bent, her uniform stained with things that didn't bear thinking about, her face etched with the kind of bone-deep fatigue that came from working multiple jobs to support a dream that might never come true. She worked 16-hour shifts, James continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a documentary narrator, often sleeping in her car between jobs to save money on transport. The Thompson family lives in a council flat in Tower Hamlets. That's social housing for those unfamiliar with such things, in a building that's been condemned twice for safety violations. Each word was a physical blow, but Malik remained frozen in his seat, paralyzed by the enormity of what was happening to him. This wasn't just public humiliation. It was the systematic destruction of everything he held sacred, the weaponization of his mother's sacrifice against him. But here's the truly interesting part, James said, producing another photograph that made Malik's world stop spinning entirely. This one showed his father, not as Malik remembered him, strong and confident and full of life, but in his final days, wasted by the cancer that had eaten him alive from the inside. David Thompson lay in a hospital bed, surrounded by the machinery that had kept him breathing just long enough to say goodbye to his son, his once powerful frame reduced to skin and bones, and the terrible dignity of a man dying too young. David Thompson, James announced to the assembled school, former professional fighter, dead of stomach cancer at 38. No insurance, no savings, no provision for his family's future. Just another cautionary tale about what happens when people try to live beyond their means and ignore the realities of their situation. The silence that followed was different from before. Heavier, more terrible, charged with the kind of collective shock that comes from witnessing something that crosses every line of human decency. Even at Blackidge Academy, where cruelty was elevated to an art form, there were boundaries that weren't supposed to be crossed. Speaking ill of the dead, mocking a family's grief, using a man's final moments as ammunition in an adolescent power struggle. These things violated codes that transcended social class or educational privilege. But James wasn't finished. He had one more revelation to share, one final violation that would push Malik past every boundary his father had taught him to respect. The best part, James said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that somehow carried across the entire hall, is that David Thompson wasn't just any fighter. He was what they call a has-been, someone who had a brief moment of success before reality caught up with him. Won a few regional championships, got delusions of grandeur, thought he could make it in the big leagues. But talent without breeding only takes you so far, doesn't it? He died a failure, leaving his family in poverty, and his son seems determined to follow in his footsteps. Something broke inside Malik's chest. Not his heart, which had been cracking for months, but something deeper and more fundamental. The careful structure of control that his father had built inside him, the architecture of discipline and restraint that had defined every interaction since arriving at Blackidge Academy, simply collapsed under the weight of this final violation. David Thompson had not died a failure. He had died a champion, not just in the ring, where his record spoke for itself, but in life, where he had raised a son with love and wisdom and taught him that strength was about protecting the innocent, not dominating the weak. He had been a teacher, a mentor, a man who could have destroyed any opponent he faced but chose instead to build rather than break, to heal rather than hurt. And now his memory was being desecrated by a spoiled child who had never earned anything in his life, never faced real adversity, never had to choose between eating and paying rent or working double shifts to keep hope alive for someone else's future. Malik stood up. The movement was fluid, and controlled, but there was something in the way he rose that made conversations die mid-sentence and turned every head in the hall toward him. For months, he had been the ghost student, the invisible presence that others looked through rather than at. But now, as he stood in the back of the assembly hall with his fists slowly unclenching at his sides, he commanded attention with the gravity of someone who had finally decided to stop hiding. "That's enough," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent hall. Not shouting, not pleading, just a simple statement of fact delivered with the kind of quiet authority that comes from absolute certainty. James turned toward him with a smile that was part triumph and part predatory anticipation. "Oh, did I strike a nerve? Maybe you'd like to share some of your own insights about your family situation? Help everyone understand what kind of background produces the attitude problems we've been discussing." What happened next unfolded in the kind of crystalline slow motion that occurs during moments of absolute crisis. Malik began walking toward the front of the hall, his movements so fluid and purposeful that students instinctively shrank back to create a path for him. There was something in his bearing that spoke of violence held in perfect check, of power barely contained beneath a surface of supernatural calm. "You want to know about my father?" Malik said, his voice carrying an edge that made the temperature in the room seem to drop by several degrees. David Thompson was regional middleweight champion for 3 consecutive years. He represented Great Britain in international competition. He trained fighters who went on to become world champions. And more importantly than any of that, he was a man who taught his son that real strength meant protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. James's smile faltered slightly, but his confidence remained intact. After all, what could a scholarship student do to him in front of 400 witnesses and the headmaster himself? What possible threat could someone from Malik's background pose to someone with his resources and protection? "How touching," James replied. But there was something forced about his casual cruelty now. "I'm sure he was very proud of raising such a well-adjusted, socially integrated son. Really prepared you for the real world, didn't he?" That was the moment. The precise instant when Malik's promise to his father, the sacred vow never to use his fists in anger, met an immovable object called protecting his family's honor, and found that some things were more important than keeping your word to the dead. "He also taught me," Malik said, closing the distance between himself and James with the measured pace of someone who had all the time in the world, that there comes a moment when a man has to choose between being peaceful and being righteous, and that sometimes protecting what matters most requires you to become exactly what your enemies think you already are. The first hint that James Whitmore had made a catastrophic miscalculation came when Malik moved. Not the awkward, untrained swinging of an angry teenager, but the fluid, economical motion of someone who had spent 11 years learning how to dismantle human beings with scientific precision. James had approximately half a second to register that the scholarship kid he had been tormenting for months was closing the distance between them with the controlled aggression of a trained predator before his world exploded into chaos. Malik's first strike was a textbook jab, straight, fast, and delivered with the full weight of 17 years of accumulated rage behind it. It caught James square in the solar plexus, driving the air from his lungs and doubling him over like a broken doll. Before the sound of impact had even registered with the watching students, Malik's second blow was already in motion. An uppercut that straightened James up and sent him staggering backward, blood streaming from his nose in twin rivers of crimson. But what truly shocked the assembled students of Blackidge Academy wasn't the violence itself. They had all seen fights before, witnessed the clumsy grappling and wild swinging that characterized most adolescent confrontations. What shocked them was the precision, the control, the absolute mastery of technique that Malik displayed as he systematically dismantled their golden boy with movements so fluid they looked like choreography. James tried to fight back, throwing a wild haymaker that would have connected with devastating force if his target had been an ordinary student. But Malik wasn't ordinary, and the punch found nothing but air as he stepped inside James's guard and delivered a combination that would have made his father proud. Body shot, head movement, another body shot, and then a perfectly timed hook that sent James crashing into the chairs with a sound like breaking kindling. The entire assembly had erupted into chaos, students screaming, teachers shouting, the headmaster bellowing for order that would never come. But in the eye of the storm, Malik moved with the calm confidence of someone who had finally stopped fighting against his nature and embraced what he had always been underneath the careful facade of restraint. James tried to get up, his face a mask of blood and disbelief, his expensive uniform torn and dirty, his carefully styled hair now hanging in his eyes like a curtain of defeat. For months, he had seen Malik as a victim, someone to be toyed with, humiliated, and eventually discarded. He had never imagined that his target might possess the kind of skill that could end fights before they properly began. "Stay down," Malik said, his voice carrying a note of professional courtesy that was somehow more terrifying than any threat. "This doesn't have to get worse." But James Whitmore had never stayed down from anything in his life. Pride, privilege, and 17 years of getting his way through manipulation and intimidation had created a young man who literally couldn't comprehend the concept of being outmatched. He charged forward with a roar of fury that was equal parts rage and humiliation, determined to prove that this was all some kind of fluke, some accident that could be corrected through sheer force of will. What followed was not a fight. It was a clinic. Malik's defensive movements were so subtle, they seemed like magic. James's punches simply couldn't find their target, sliding past like water around a stone, while Malik's counterattacks landed with surgical precision. A leg kick that buckled James's knee, an elbow strike that opened a cut above his eye. A takedown that put him on the ground so hard the impact could be heard in the back rows of the assembly hall. In less than 30 seconds, it was over. James Whitmore, heir to the Blackidge Academy dynasty, tormentor of the innocent, architect of systematic cruelty, lay on the polished floor of the assembly hall, gasping like a fish out of water, while his classmates stared in stunned silence at the transformation they had just witnessed. Malik stood over him, breathing hard but controlled, his uniform barely wrinkled despite the violence that had just occurred. When he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the hall, clear and strong and absolutely final. "My name is Malik Thompson," he said, each word falling into the silence like a stone into still water. "My father was David Thompson, 3-time regional middleweight champion and one of the finest men who ever lived. My mother is Linda Thompson, a registered nurse who has saved more lives than you will ever touch with your pathetic existence. I'm here on academic scholarship because I earned it, not because I was born to it, not because it was bought for me, but because I worked for it every single day of my life." He paused, looking around the assembly hall at faces that would never look at him the same way again. The invisible student had become very visible indeed, and the power dynamics that had governed Blackidge Academy for generations had just shifted in ways that no one could have predicted. "I have spent 4 months in this place being told that I don't belong here, that people like me should know our place, that talent without breeding is worthless. Well, let me tell you what I learned from my father about breeding. It's not about the family you're born into. It's about the person you choose to become. And I choose to be someone who protects the innocent and stands up to bullies, no matter what the cost." The assembly hall remained frozen in tableau. 400 students and faculty witnessing the birth of a legend, the moment when power shifted from those who inherited it to someone who had taken it by force of will and skill. James Whitmore lay at Malik's feet like a broken symbol of everything wrong with their world, while the scholarship kid he had tried to destroy stood tall and unashamed, finally revealed as what he had always been beneath the surface. But the most important revelation wasn't about Malik's fighting skills or hidden strength. It was about the difference between a victim and a survivor, between someone who accepts injustice and someone who refuses to be broken by it. For 4 months, Blackidge Academy had tried to teach Malik Thompson his place. In 30 seconds, he had taught them theirs. The silence that followed Malik's declaration stretched like a held breath across the assembly hall of Blackidge Academy. 400 students sat frozen in their chairs, their minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. Not just the systematic dismantling of James Whitmore, but the complete inversion of everything they thought they knew about power, privilege, and the natural order of their insular world. James lay on the polished floor like a broken doll, his designer uniform torn and bloodied, his carefully cultivated image of invincibility shattered as completely as his nose. Blood pooled beneath his face, mixing with tears of pain and humiliation to create a crimson testament to the difference between inherited authority and earned respect. Every breath came as a wheeze through damaged cartilage, each movement a reminder that he had finally encountered someone who couldn't be intimidated, bought, or broken through institutional pressure. But it was the expressions on the faces of the watching students that revealed the true scope of what had just occurred. These were young people who had been raised to believe that breeding determined destiny, that social position was as immutable as genetics, that people like Malik Thompson were meant to serve rather than lead, to submit rather than dominate. The cognitive dissonance of seeing their assumptions physically demolished was written across their features like psychological whiplash. Sarah Chen sat 3 rows from the front, her wire-rimmed glasses reflecting the overhead lights as tears gathered in her eyes. Not tears of shock or fear, but something deeper. Recognition, perhaps, or the shame that comes from realizing you've been complicit in something monstrous. She thought of the chemistry class where she had abandoned Malik for the safety of James's approval, the moment when she had chosen social survival over simple human decency. The boy who had just displayed such devastating skill and restraint could have been her friend, could have been her ally in navigating the treacherous waters of Blackidge Academy's social ecosystem. Instead, she had helped isolate him, helped create the conditions that led to this explosive confrontation. Marcus Ashford, James's most devoted follower, sat paralyzed with a terror that went beyond the physical. For months, he had participated in the systematic torment of someone he now realized could have ended any of them without breaking a sweat. Every cruel comment, every casual act of social exclusion, every moment of laughter at Malik's expense now felt like taunting a caged tiger, safe only as long as the bars held firm. The bars had just been ripped away, and Marcus was beginning to understand that mercy was the only reason he wasn't lying beside his friend on the blood-stained floor. Headmaster Whitmore stood at the podium, his face cycling through expressions of shock, fury, and something that might have been grudging respect. His son, the heir to the Blackidge Academy legacy, the golden boy who was supposed to embody everything the institution stood for, had just been humiliated in front of the entire school by a scholarship student from South London. The implications went far beyond a simple fight between teenagers. This was a challenge to the fundamental assumptions that governed their world, a demonstration that talent and determination could triumph over privilege and position in ways that made comfortable hierarchies suddenly seem fragile and artificial. But perhaps the most profound transformation was occurring in Malik himself. For 4 months, he had carried the weight of his father's teachings like chains around his soul, honoring a promise that had become a prison, maintaining a restraint that had enabled his own torment. The boy who had walked into Blackidge Academy believing that dignity lay in turning the other cheek had discovered something his father had never explicitly taught him, that there were moments when peace became complicity, when restraint became cowardice, when the only way to honor the memory of the dead was to protect the living. Standing over James Whitmore's broken form, Malik felt a clarity he hadn't experienced since his father's death. Not the savage satisfaction of violence, but the deep peace that came from finally being authentically himself. He was David Thompson's son, not just in genetics, but in spirit. A protector, a champion, someone who stood between predators and their prey, regardless of the personal cost. The spell of silence was finally broken by the sound of approaching footsteps. Coach Davidson pushed through the crowd of students, his weathered face grim with professional assessment as he knelt beside James's motionless form. Years of rugby matches and training injuries had given him expertise in evaluating damage, and what he saw made him whistle low under his breath. Broken nose, definitely. Possible concussion. This boy needs medical attention immediately. He looked up at Malik with an expression that contained no condemnation, only the grudging respect of one fighter recognizing another. That was some of the finest technique I've ever seen. Where did you learn to move like that? My father taught me, Malik replied, his voice carrying across the hall with quiet pride. David Thompson. He believed that skill without discipline was worthless, and that true strength meant knowing when not to fight as much as knowing how to win when you had no choice. David Thompson. Coach Davidson's eyes widened with recognition, and suddenly his assessment of the situation shifted entirely. Bloody hell, you're the son of the David Thompson, three-time regional middleweight champion, the man who turned down a shot at the European title because he wanted to spend more time with his family. The murmur that rippled through the assembled students carried a different quality now, not just shock, but dawning awareness that they had been in the presence of something extraordinary without realizing it. David Thompson wasn't just some failed fighter as James had portrayed him. He was a legend in British martial arts circles, someone who had chosen love over glory and become more respected for that choice than any championship could have made him. He was my coach for 2 years before he got sick, Davidson continued, his voice heavy with genuine sorrow. One of the finest men I ever knew, and the most technically gifted fighter I've seen in 30 years of involvement in the sport. If he taught you to move like that, he paused, looking at James's unconscious form with new understanding. This wasn't a fight. This was a master class. Mrs. Pemberton had arrived with the school nurse and a stretcher team, their efficient movements creating a bubble of medical activity around James's prone form. But even as they worked to stabilize the injured student, the real drama was playing out in the psychological space between Malik and the rest of the school community. Headmaster Whitmore finally found his voice, though it carried none of its usual authority. Mr. Thompson, we need to discuss what just happened here. The consequences of violence in our institution are what? Malik interrupted, his voice cutting through the headmaster's carefully constructed rhetoric like a blade through silk. Are you going to expel me for defending my family's honor? For refusing to sit quietly while your son desecrated my father's memory and mocked my mother's sacrifice? Because if that's the kind of institution Blackidge Academy really is, one that protects bullies and punishes their victims for finally fighting back, then maybe I don't belong here after all. The challenge hung in the air like smoke, visible to everyone and impossible to ignore. Headmaster Whitmore found himself caught between institutional protocol and the dawning realization that his son had been the architect of his own destruction. Every cruel comment, every calculated humiliation, every systematic attempt to drive Malik away had been building toward this moment. James had created his own nemesis through months of dedicated cruelty, and now the bill had come due in the most public way possible. The medical team is taking James to hospital, Mrs. Pemberton announced, her voice cutting through the tension with bureaucratic precision. He's conscious but disoriented, probable concussion, as Coach Davidson assessed. As the stretcher team lifted James's broken form and began moving toward the exit, something extraordinary happened. One by one, students began to stand, not in protest or anger, but in something that looked remarkably like respect. It started with a girl in the front row that Malik didn't recognize, then spread backward through the assembly hall like a wave of recognition. They weren't applauding his violence. They were acknowledging his courage, the moral fortitude required to endure months of systematic torment while maintaining his dignity, and the strength of character that had finally compelled him to act when the assault shifted from his person to his family's memory. For many of them, this was the first time they had witnessed someone stand up to institutional power and prevail. The first demonstration that the hierarchies they had accepted as natural law were actually fragile constructs maintained through collective agreement rather than inherent truth. Sarah Chen was crying openly now, her tears a mixture of shame and relief, and something that might have been hope. She had spent 4 months watching systematic cruelty unfold while convincing herself that her silence was prudence rather than cowardice. Seeing Malik finally unleash the strength he had been hiding made her realize that she had been protecting herself at the expense of someone who deserved her friendship, her loyalty, her basic human decency. As the applause continued to build, other sounds began to emerge from the crowd. Voices calling out apologies, expressions of support, admissions of guilt from students who had participated in Malik's isolation through action or inaction. The psychological dam that had held their community's cruelty in place was finally breaking, releasing a flood of recognition that they had all been complicit in something shameful. But the most important voice came from an unexpected source. Mr. Thompson. Headmaster Whitmore's voice cut through the growing noise, commanding attention through sheer force of institutional authority. "A word, if you please." The crowd fell silent again, waiting to see whether this moment of transformation would survive contact with administrative reality. Malik approached the podium with the same fluid confidence he had displayed during the confrontation, his movements suggesting someone who had nothing left to fear because he had already paid the highest price he was willing to pay. "I owe you an apology," the headmaster said, his words carrying clearly across the assembly hall despite being pitched for private conversation. "And more than that, I owe you an explanation. My son's behavior, the systematic harassment you've endured since arriving at our institution, was unconscionable. It was enabled by staff who should have known better, including myself. We failed you, Mr. Thompson. We failed your family, and we failed the values this institution claims to represent." The admission hit the assembled students like a physical force. Headmaster Whitmore, the ultimate authority figure in their world, the man whose word was literally law within the walls of Blackidge Academy, was publicly acknowledging institutional failure. More than that, he was accepting responsibility for creating the conditions that had led to his own son's humiliation. "The scholarship review that was threatened, it's cancelled. Your place here is secure for as long as you choose to remain with us. Furthermore, we will be conducting a comprehensive examination of our policies regarding student welfare and harassment prevention. What happened to you should never happen to anyone, and we will ensure that it doesn't." Malik studied the headmaster's face, looking for signs of deception or political calculation. But what he saw was something rarer in institutional leadership: genuine remorse, the recognition that power carried responsibility, and that abdicating that responsibility had consequences that extended far beyond administrative convenience. "I appreciate that, sir," Malik replied, his voice carrying the quiet dignity that had sustained him through months of torment. "But respectfully, this isn't just about me anymore. Every student in this hall has witnessed what happens when systematic cruelty is allowed to flourish unchecked. They've seen how institutional silence enables individual evil. If you really want to honor my family's sacrifice and my father's memory, then make sure this place becomes somewhere he would have been proud to see his son educated." The headmaster nodded slowly, understanding that he was being given an opportunity for redemption that few leaders received, the chance to transform crisis into genuine reform, to use public failure as a catalyst for institutional change. As the assembly finally began to disperse, students moving in small groups toward their next classes, the conversations that filled the corridors carried a different quality than usual. The casual cruelty that had characterized so much of Blackidge Academy's social dynamics seemed suddenly anachronistic, exposed as the petty savagery of people who had never been forced to examine the consequences of their actions. Malik walked alone through hallways that felt fundamentally different than they had that morning. Not because the Gothic architecture had changed, or because the portraits of dead benefactors had suddenly developed consciences, but because power had shifted in ways that would ripple through the institution for years to come. He was no longer the invisible scholarship student, the victim to be toyed with and eventually discarded. He was Malik Thompson, son of champions, defender of the innocent, someone who had proven that dignity was not something granted by others, but something claimed by those with the courage to stand up for what mattered most. But perhaps the most profound change was internal. For the first time since his father's death, Malik felt like he was walking in David Thompson's footsteps rather than struggling to live up to an impossible standard. He had learned that his father's teachings about restraint and discipline weren't meant to make him weak. They were meant to make his strength more powerful when it was finally unleashed in service of something righteous. The boy who had arrived at Blackidge Academy 4 months ago, desperate to fit in and terrified of standing out, was gone forever. In his place stood a young man who understood that true belonging wasn't about changing yourself to match your environment. It was about having the courage to change your environment to match your values. And in the Gothic towers of Blackidge Academy, where tradition had reigned supreme for over 2 centuries, the winds of change were finally beginning to blow. 3 months later, the corridors of Blackidge Academy hummed with a different energy entirely. The Gothic stones remained the same. The stained glass windows still painted the floors in jeweled light, and the portraits of stern-faced benefactors continued their eternal watch over the institution they had helped build. But something fundamental had shifted in the invisible architecture of the school, the unspoken rules that governed how students treated each other, the casual hierarchies that had once seemed as immutable as the building's foundation stones. Malik Thompson walked through those corridors now, not as an invisible scholarship student or a target for systematic cruelty, but as something entirely new in Blackidge Academy's 200-year history, a bridge between worlds that had never truly communicated before. His presence had become a catalyst for conversations that previous generations of students had never thought to have. Questions about privilege and responsibility that challenged comfortable assumptions about how their society functioned. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. In the immediate aftermath of the Assembly Hall confrontation, there had been resistance, parents outraged that their children were being subjected to violence, alumni threatening to withdraw donations, board members questioning whether the institution's standards were being compromised by social engineering. But Headmaster Whitmore had held firm, using his son's public humiliation as a teaching moment about the difference between authority and leadership, between inherited position and earned respect. James Whitmore himself had returned to school after a week in hospital and another month of recovery, his nose bearing a permanent reminder of the day his assumptions about the world had been violently corrected. But the most remarkable transformation wasn't physical, it was psychological. The arrogant young man who had orchestrated months of systematic cruelty had been replaced by someone quieter, more thoughtful, burdened with the kind of shame that comes from seeing yourself clearly for the first time. The conversation between James and Malik, when it finally came, took place in the school's chapel on a grey February afternoon. The Gothic architecture seemed appropriate for a confession, the stained glass filtering pale sunlight across wooden pews that had absorbed centuries of whispered secrets and desperate prayers. "I've been wanting to apologize," James said, his voice barely above a whisper, the words echoing in the vast space like stones dropped into still water. "Not just for what happened in assembly, but for everything. For months of making your life hell, for involving your family, for being the kind of person who thought that was acceptable." Malik sat in silence for a long moment, studying the boy who had once seemed like an insurmountable force of institutional cruelty. The James Whitmore sitting beside him now looked smaller somehow, diminished not by physical injury, but by the terrible weight of self-knowledge. His hands trembled slightly as he spoke, and there were shadows under his eyes that suggested sleepless nights spent confronting uncomfortable truths about his own character. "Why?" Malik asked finally, the question carrying years of accumulated pain and confusion. "Why me? Why any of it?" James laughed bitterly, the sound harsh against the chapel's sacred acoustics. "Because I could. Because I'd never met anyone I couldn't break through money or connections or institutional pressure. Because seeing someone like you, someone with actual talent, actual strength, actual character, made me realize how empty my own achievements were. I'd been handed everything I had, and you'd earned everything you had, and I couldn't stand the comparison. The honesty was brutal and complete, stripping away every rationalization and excuse that might have softened the edges of James's cruelty. He had tortured Malik, not out of ignorance or casual malice, but out of a deep-seated insecurity about his own worth, a recognition that privilege was a poor substitute for character, and that inherited power paled in comparison to earned respect. "I don't expect forgiveness," James continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke the words that had been building inside him for months. "I don't deserve it, but I want you to know that watching you refuse to break, watching you maintain your dignity through everything I put you through, it taught me more about strength than anything my father ever said about tradition and breeding. You were everything I pretended to be, and I hated you for it." Malik considered the broken boy beside him, recognizing something in James's pain that resonated with his own journey toward understanding. They were both products of their circumstances, one raised to believe that strength came from dominance, the other taught that true power lay in protection. The collision between those worldviews had been inevitable, but perhaps the aftermath could serve a purpose beyond simple justice. "My father used to say that the strongest person in any room is the one who lifts others up, rather than tearing them down," Malik replied, his words measured and thoughtful. "You spent months trying to tear me down because you thought that would make you stronger. But what if you spent the same energy trying to build something better?" The suggestion hung in the air between them like a challenge and an opportunity. James had the resources, the connections, the institutional influence to create real change at Blackidge Academy. What he had lacked was the moral foundation to use that power responsibly. Perhaps the humiliation he had suffered could become the beginning of a different kind of education, one that taught empathy instead of entitlement, service instead of dominance. The changes that followed were gradual but profound. James began using his influence to champion initiatives that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Anti-bullying programs that address systemic harassment rather than individual incidents, diversity scholarships that brought more students from non-traditional backgrounds into the school, peer support networks that connected privileged students with those navigating financial hardship. But the most significant transformation was happening in the daily interactions between students who had previously existed in separate social ecosystems. Sarah Chen, freed from the terror of social exile, had become one of Malik's closest friends, their shared love of chemistry evolving into a genuine partnership that produced award-winning research on sustainable energy solutions. Marcus Ashford, James's former enabler, channeled his organizational skills into creating mentorship programs that paired older students with newcomers who might otherwise struggle with the transition to Blackidge Academy's demanding environment. The rugby team, once a bastion of casual cruelty disguised as masculine bonding, evolved into something approaching a true brotherhood under Coach Davidson's reformed leadership. Players learned that strength meant protecting teammates rather than dominating opponents, that victory was meaningless if it came at the cost of honor and integrity. Malik became team captain not through intimidation or inherited privilege, but through the kind of quiet leadership that inspired others to become better versions of themselves. But perhaps the most meaningful change came in the form of a small memorial garden planted behind the school's chapel, dedicated to the memory of David Thompson and other parents who had sacrificed everything for their children's education. The garden wasn't Malik's idea. It emerged from a student initiative led by James Whitmore, a public acknowledgement that strength came from service, that true nobility was measured in sacrifice rather than birthright. The dedication ceremony took place on a warm spring afternoon, with students and faculty gathered around a simple granite stone that bore David Thompson's name and the words he had lived by. True strength protects the innocent. Linda Thompson stood beside her son, her nurse's uniform exchanged for a simple dress that couldn't hide the pride radiating from her exhausted features. She had worked extra shifts to attend the ceremony, but nothing could have kept her away from this moment of recognition for the man who had shaped both their lives through his example. "Dad would have loved this place," Malik said, addressing the gathered crowd with the easy confidence that had replaced his earlier guardedness. Not the buildings or the traditions or the prestige, but what it's becoming. A place where students learn that privilege is a responsibility, not a right. Where strength is measured by how you treat people who can't fight back, not how effectively you can dominate those weaker than yourself. Headmaster Whitmore spoke about institutional transformation, about the courage required to acknowledge systemic failures and the commitment needed to build something better from the wreckage of old assumptions. But his words carried less weight than the simple presence of students who had learned to see each other as human beings rather than representatives of competing social classes. As the ceremony concluded and people began to drift away in small groups, their conversations filled with plans for the future rather than grievances from the past, Malik found himself standing alone in the memorial garden with his mother. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the carefully tended flowers, and the Gothic towers of Blackidge Academy rose around them like protective guardians rather than intimidating barriers. "Your father would be so proud," Linda whispered, her voice thick with emotion as she traced her husband's name on the granite memorial. "Not just of your strength, but of your character. Of the way you honored his memory by becoming exactly the kind of man he raised you to be." Malik thought about the promise he had made to his father, never to use his fists in anger, and how breaking that promise had paradoxically become the greatest way to honor his memory. Sometimes love required violence, sometimes protection demanded destruction. Sometimes the only way to build something beautiful was to tear down something rotten, even if it meant challenging every comfortable assumption about how the world was supposed to work. "He taught me that strength isn't about winning fights," Malik replied, watching other students move through the garden with the easy friendship that had replaced the rigid hierarchies of months past. "It's about fighting for things worth winning: family, honor, the right of every person to be treated with dignity, regardless of where they come from or what they look like." The months that followed brought their own challenges and triumphs. Malik's academic achievements earned him early admission to Cambridge University, where he would study international relations with a focus on conflict resolution, skills he had learned through necessity rather than textbooks. James Whitmore, transformed by his own reckoning with privilege and responsibility, chose a different path entirely, dedicating himself to social work and community organizing in the same South London neighborhoods that had shaped Malik's early life. But the true measure of their success wasn't found in individual achievements or career trajectories. It was visible in the culture of Blackidge Academy itself, which had evolved from an institution that perpetuated class divisions into one that challenged students to transcend them. The scholarship program expanded dramatically, bringing in young people from every corner of British society. The anti-bullying initiatives became models for other schools. The Memorial Garden became a place where students came to reflect on the difference between inherited privilege and earned respect. Years later, when Malik returned to speak at the school's annual diversity celebration, he found a place transformed beyond recognition. Students who would never have spoken to each other in the old regime collaborated on projects that addressed real-world problems. The rigid social hierarchies that had once defined every interaction had been replaced by fluid communities based on shared interests and mutual respect. Standing at the same podium where his character had once been assassinated by James Whitmore's calculated cruelty, Malik addressed a new generation of students who faced their own challenges in navigating privilege and responsibility, inclusion and identity, individual achievement and collective good. "My father taught me that true strength protects the innocent," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled students. "But what I learned here at Blackidge Academy is that sometimes the innocent are the ones who don't yet know their own strength. Sometimes the person who needs protection is the bully, who has never learned that power comes with responsibility. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemies, it's helping them become allies in building something better." The applause that greeted his words was different from the stunned silence that had followed his physical confrontation with James years earlier. This was recognition rather than shock, gratitude rather than fear, hope rather than resignation. These students understood that they were inheriting a world in desperate need of leaders who could bridge divides rather than deepening them, who could use privilege as a tool for justice rather than a weapon for oppression. As Malik walked through the corridors of Blackidge Academy one final time, past the Memorial Garden where his father's name would inspire future generations of students, he carried with him the knowledge that transformation was possible even in the most entrenched institutions. Change began with individual courage, the willingness to stand up for what was right even when the cost seemed impossibly high. But it was sustained through collective commitment, through communities that chose to hold themselves accountable to higher standards than mere tradition or convenience. The boy who had arrived at Blackidge Academy as a frightened scholarship student, desperate to fit in and terrified of standing out, had become something entirely different. A catalyst for institutional change, a bridge between divided worlds. A living example of his father's teaching that strength was measured not by the battles you won, but by the peace you built in their aftermath. And in the Gothic towers of an ancient institution, slowly learning to honor its highest ideals rather than its worst impulses, David Thompson's legacy lived on. Not in the violence his son had been trained to deliver, but in the healing he had chosen to create instead. The story ends where it began, with a young man walking through the gates of Blackidge Academy. But this time, he walks not as a victim seeking acceptance, but as a leader offering transformation. Not as someone asking for permission to belong, but as someone with the power to redefine what belonging means. Because sometimes, the quiet kid who gets picked on every day isn't hiding weakness. Sometimes they're hiding the strength to change the world. And sometimes, the world is finally ready to be changed. If this story touched you, if it reminded you of your own moments when silence felt like the safest choice, but courage demanded something more, then share it with someone who needs to remember their own hidden strength. Because in every school, every workplace, every community where power goes unchecked and cruelty masquerades as tradition, There are people waiting for permission to stand up, to speak out, to refuse to accept that injustice is simply the way things have always been. The question isn't whether you have the strength to make a difference. The question is whether you have the courage to discover just how strong you really are.